Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you.
I still have some.
Thank you, Joe. You guys do good to me. Take care of me.
Take care of you, my
Yes,
friend.
sir. Good. And I appreciate it. Joe. The parents should.
Be able to join.
Yeah.
Go back. You too.
All right, we have an issue here. Oh. Matt, this is not going to the camera now.
Hold on. I just have to share my screen.
Okay,
And that's not a problem. One second.
not ready. Because for some reason, it has me instead of our.
You need to make me a host though, or somebody needs to let me do that.
No. Should be able to just share.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah, well, I can make you host, but we're not, so.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, we have an issue here.
I'm still waiting.
And Matt DeHaven needs to be able to do it as well. There should be a way to do that. through Zoom.
I don't.
Yeah, we should be able to share screen.
Yeah.
There we go. Now I can do it. I got it.
And before I give it to the public, yeah, but it says.
Okay, so did you share them?
I'm gonna share that screen, and you should be able to see it on your thing there.
But they're going.
Well, the issue is you need to be able to go
That's my goal.
to the commission,
Yeah, we're just doing a broadband.
which is that camera.
Because that'll get information on our page.
Okay.
It shouldn't be me, and I don't know why it's me instead of our camera. Matt, for some reason, we're getting me on screen instead of our camera.
Tell me that again.
On ours?
Her computer
Yeah,
is the
it
host of the
should
thing.
be that camera, not my.
You just need to
laptop.
change the device settings in there.
I don't know how they got changed in the
But you
first
made
place.
the young lady a host, you made Heather a host. And she's
Well, it was
sharing
doing that even before.
her screen. Oh, I see. It's got her webcam.
No, yeah, her
On here,
webcam.
it's got her webcam.
And it should be this camera. is what
Right.
she's
Right.
Yeah.
Fine.
That's because it's plugged into your computer like that.
It was fine last night. I changed it.
This is me now, power. This is me. There's no wire. And that's fed from your laptop. So it's a connection, something there.
It's the device setting on the laptop, and it's this one right here. And you should just be able to switch it.
Switch it to.
No, leave it in there, but on your computer, you should go to the device options where it says video, and it should give you choose video or go to video settings. And instead of integrated camera, it needs to be the Logitech Rio.
Logitech camera settings, go there.
You want to mark that as the camera to use.
Do settings, you said devices. Uh, 1080 Pro Stream.
Try that one. The light should not be on. I think.
Downsize.
We do it every Tuesday, Wednesday.
Downsize.
It's not.
It's the mail.
And it's more active.
Yeah.
Go back to Zoom here.
And that little arrow at the top. There. And change it to that.
I got you. Thanks.
I should have done.
Okay, there you go. Okay, sorry.
Are we ready?
Yes, ma'am, I think that will be.
I gotta turn that one too.
I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the Maysville Board of Commissioners Wednesday, November 10th at 12 p.m. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Brammer?
Yes.
Commissioner Cartwell? Commissioner Wood?
Yes.
Commissioner McKay?
Yes, ma'am.
Mayor Cottrell?
Yes, ma'am.
City Manager Wallingford?
Here.
And the chief is
Here.
Chief Doyle.
And also with us today, we have County Judge Executive Owen McNeil, County Commissioners McKay and Day. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. McNeil to introduce our guest speaker.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good evening.
Today we wanted to bring in Miss Heather Mills with CTC Technology, who has been diligently working away to try to better understand where we are in our broadband assets here, our speeds and capacities, and the most efficient way to go forward in the future. And so, I'm excited and have been telling folks that this new proactive approach to firming up and bettering our broadband is going to be very beneficial in the future. And so, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ms. Heather Mills, CTC, and let her walk us through their findings.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome, everyone. With me today on the Zoom is, can you guys hear me all right? I'll shift over a little. Yeah, too much NILB interference there. With me on the line today is my wonderful colleague, Matthew DeHaven. I'm the Vice President of Grant Funding Strategies for CTC Technology and Energy. Matt is our Vice President of Fiber Infrastructure. And we've got a lot to cover today. There's extra content in the slide deck that we're going to sort of glaze over, but we'll give it to you guys as well. We don't want to bore you. We don't want you to fall asleep, but we do want you to feel like you can ask us questions. Please interrupt as we go through this. Our hope is that we are giving you a good sense of where you are now and how you can make decisions for where you want to go. So please definitely ask questions as we go. Anything before I start? All right, Matt, can you hear everything all right?
I sure can, and good afternoon, everyone.
We cannot hear you.
You can't hear me.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
You're not muted there.
Nope. Can you hear me now? No.
Will you check your input there and I'll get started? All right. Okay, so the agenda today, I'm gonna give you all a quick overview of what we've been tasked with and sort of what's remaining in our scope of work if you choose for us to continue that way. And we're gonna go over where we are. We did a speed test for you. We've done a service availability review. Matt and his team have done a cost estimate and benchmark. We're gonna let you pause and have a break for questions as well, because that's a lot to go through. Then I'm going to go over some grant opportunities and the outlook for that, and we'll talk about recommendations as well. And I'll go over some sort of business models that you can think about as sort of next steps and how that would all come together. So our scope of work, in general, our efforts have been to evaluate overall service availability. And so what we did is we set up a speed test site for you. And then our outside plant team came in person, and they drove the roads. They actually did it twice, believe it or not. I had them come back because I wanted more detail, and went down as many roads as they possibly could. It's not a perfect thing. There's always a few roads that are inaccessible because they're private, or maybe there was construction happening. And then our fiber infrastructure team takes a look at all of that information, collates it together, looks at the 477 data. 477 data is data that the ISPs, the internet providers, report up to the federal government on where they say they have service. Problem with that data, of course, and Matt will tell you a little bit more detail about that, is that it's a little bit overstated, partly because of the structure of how that data comes in. It's based on a census block total. So if one house in the census block is served, then they consider the entire census block served. You can see the problem with that. We're also then engaged to make sure that we give you an overview of funding opportunities that are out there and the outlook that's there, and give you an overview of what your opportunities are as far as next steps. And so I'll give you basically a look-see at the 4 or 5 different general best practices types of broadband approaches for solving this kind of problem. And then if you want in the future, if you decide that's the route you want to go, we're certainly able and available to help with grant applications and things to help fund whatever it is you'd like to do. All right. So common things I want to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. It's always hard to sort of pause at the beginning after I get going with that wonderful start that I just gave you and sort of give you some language, but I want to make sure, because we know that we use lingo that may sound a little bit strange. So when we say things like FTTP, what we mean is fiber to the premises or fiber to the home. That's the connection from the street to your house or to your business. Megabits or Mbps or Gbps, gigabits, we're talking about the speed of your connection. For example, 1,000 megabits is equal to 1 gigabit. Okay, and broadband in general is the speed of broadband is defined at 25 megabits and 3 megabits. So 25 down, 3 megabits up. I always mix those up in my head for whatever reason. I do too. I will make mention today of something called RDOF, that is the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund. The only reason that's important is because there were some areas awarded in this reverse auction that the FCC did throughout the county, mostly to 2 providers, and I'll get there on how that affects things. It's going to affect what you can apply for grants should you decide to get there. And then OSP means outside plant engineer. Generally, that refers to telecommunications infrastructure design and implementation. All right.
Commissioners, can you guys please mute your microphones? They're getting a little, the audience is getting feedback.
So let's start with where we are. We put out, as I said, a website that we call Speed Survey, and that pulls together approximately, I think it was 800 surveys were taken. So the speed survey takes in surveys and speed tests. And so there were 66 of those surveys where people logged in very nicely and let us know that they do not have any service. And then there were 743 speed tests in which we were able to discern, how fast their connections were. And I've provided an overview up there of generally the providers that were included. In the other category, it does include AT&T and Verizon and I think T-Mobile, but a very small percentage of the overall in there. And what this all tells us is that technically, most of the county and city are what I would call served. They're just not well served. 70% of the speed tests showed that those individuals who took the test were getting less than broadband speeds. And that's important. And one of the questions that the team had as we were doing the speed test is, do we need to get more of them? We did this over 3 weeks. We thought that the distribution of those surveys, the amount that we got, was actually quite good. And I'll show you a map in just a second of what that looks like so you get a sense. But what this also tells me is that the county and the city are prime candidates for a lot of the federal funding programs that are coming up. Had it been sort of less than this, or sorry, had I seen more real broadband speed, I think that would be a different conversation altogether. But in the future, what we're seeing being put into legislation about eligibility for minimum speeds for these programs is now 100 megabits over 20 megabits. So that is a far cry from what you have here. And that, for me, I think that bodes well for potential grants in the future.
Because currently it's still 25.3, but you're saying in the future, 120.
That is looking where it's going right now. So with the infrastructure bill, they've included that as the unserved. Anything under 120 would be considered unserved. So, and I think it's very likely that we'll see the FCC update that in the future. And this has everything to do with making sure that we are able to deal with the economic impact of something as significant as a pandemic in the future. To make sure that everyone can work from home, do school from home. Having 25.3 isn't necessarily enough. It will get you 2 Zoom calls simultaneously in the house. But if there are 4 people in your house and you have a lot of little smart devices, people like to get on the games at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you're not going to get anything done on just 25.3. So here's what the distribution looked like. I'm sorry it's really light, but the little circles, if they're circles, that means that the speeds were less than 25.3. And if they're pluses, that means that was 25.3 or faster. Now, you didn't get much faster than 25.3. In fact, the fastest we got that we logged throughout the county and city was only up to 31. And that came from Limestone and then Windstream in just a few places. And this will all come together really clearly when Matt gets to his presentation as he goes over what they found in the field in general. But it also sort of begs the question of reliability, affordability, and value. And what we've had conversations about in general is, essentially if half of the respondents to the speed survey indicated that they were either unhappy, neutral, or somewhat unhappy with their service. I think that that's not exactly a great indication of how things are going. But it also talks, we did also ask about how much they were paying for services, and it ranged. And understand that the majority of the county does have DSL service, but that DSL service is probably $15 or $20, so that makes sense. They're not getting much speed for that. They're probably getting at the most. But there's a couple of people who logged that they were HughesNet or Viasat was their server, and they're paying more than $100 a month for that service. So that's the range that we're looking at, and we're not even getting over 31 megabits in upload speed there. So affordability matters, and so that sort of it begs the questions. Is it reliable? Is it affordable? What really is the value that we're getting? And what does that mean for overall for the constituents? Sorry, I'm terrible when it comes to microphones, apparently. Is that better?
Yeah.
All right. All right. So with that, Matt, did you figure out your
Can you hear me now? No?
not yet? Sorry, Matt.
That's okay.
Sorry, Matt. I think
Yeah.
Matt DeHaven's probably
probably
going to dial in. We can't hear him. Have you got the phone number there, sir?
Can you hear me on the phone?
Does anyone hear him?
No. I'm dialed in as well.
He's also on the phone. That's him on the phone.
So when they call in, where does it come out of the speaker here?
He could call into my phone if you want to, Heather, and I could sit right beside you.
It's tough to get through the switchboard there.
The switchboard. Hold on a minute.
It wouldn't bring it up on this thing.
1 second, Matt. Let's try this.
We can't hear you.
Can they hear him on there?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, my audio was getting to WebEx, but not into the room there.
All right, can everybody hear him still?
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna go this route. This is fantastic.
Now it's double.
But if you guys
Is it double now?
hang up,
He's muted on there. He's muted. Okay, Matt.
And just to put my presentation up, I need to be set up to be
I'm gonna stop sharing. You should have the ability to share.
it says it's disabled. So
Are you able to set him up as a host?
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt David. The challenges of technology and remote presentations and I'm COVID. I'm glad you were able to get it.
Go for it, Matt.
Indeed, I do have the ability now. Give me one moment. You should be seeing that now.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Things are working. Here we go. So as Heather pointed out, there's a number of things that we gleaned from the survey speed test data that she provided, but that's an incomplete picture because that doesn't necessarily speak to what's really available out there. And it's really important that we look at a comparison between both what the infrastructure is providing as well as how it's being used. And where we see big disparities between the speeds that are really in the hands of the consumers and the infrastructure that is there or reported to be there, that tends to point to problems with affordability or potentially just misreporting of even what's available. So what we do to augment the kind of information that we can get from speed tests is really a deep dive into understanding what that infrastructure truly looks like in the field and what kind of gaps there potentially are in broadband infrastructure when it's capable of supporting. So I've got a few things I want to go over with you today to report on the work we've done along those lines. Starting with an analysis of federal broadband availability data. It's a good starting point that we start with, but we don't leave it there. Then we do pretty extensive broadband infrastructure field surveys that Heather alluded to. I'll give you some of the details I'm finding there as well. And then on top of that, then, and in some cases, using a lot of the information that we've collected in the field, we generate a fiber to the premises design model and detailed cost estimates to help inform potential negotiations with private partners, as well as to understand what the cost would be if the county and the city were to look at building its own infrastructure in whole or in part to address gaps in broadband infrastructure. So the first place we start is looking at the FCC's Form 477 provider data. And I think everyone really has heard a lot about this probably, and the deficiencies that really tend to exist with this data. But it is a good starting point. It's where we don't think that there are, generally speaking, providers that fail to report that they are there and operating. But there does tend to be a certain amount of overstating or over-reporting of what's there. Part of that is just a intrinsic flaw or limitation, I should say, in the way in which that data is reported, which is on a census block basis. So the individual providers report the speeds available, the type of service they offer, but they do that on a census block by census block basis. And the problem with that is an entire census block is considered served at whatever speed they're reporting it being served at, even if only a single address in that entire census block is served. And the resolution of a census block varies, obviously, depending on density and other factors. But it can be a pretty large and significant area, covering anywhere from a couple hundred potential addresses up to several thousand. This isn't your case, but in the case of the largest census block in America, I think it's somewhere in Alaska, it's something like 8,500 square miles. We don't have that situation here exactly, but a census block could be anywhere from many acres to many square miles. And so it's really not a sufficient starting point to really fully or final point rather. It's only a starting point for understanding what your broadband availability looks like in your community. So I'll quickly go through these just to show you what the data says today. They've broken down by service according to the data that's been provided most recently to the FCC. You have 700, a little more than 700 addresses served by fiber to the premises near Maysville, but outside of the downtown area primarily, which equates to about 8% of total coverage of the address points in your community. Fiber to the premises is really, that's the holy grail, right? If there's anything we want to see out there that is truly future-proof and flexible and scalable to meet current and ongoing demands indefinitely into the future, it's this type of infrastructure. So a community that has fiber to the premises to most or all of their addresses really has, in a lot of ways, maybe not competition, but they have the basic broadband availability problem addressed. And that's clearly not the case in your situation. You do have a lot more cable infrastructure though, and cable is the next best thing to fiber. It uses a lot of fiber infrastructure, but in that last mile, so to speak, it's using a coaxial cable to feed into the home. And these are the networks that traditionally have provided video content to subscribers and now are being used to provide fairly robust broadband speeds in many communities. You have over 7,000 addresses that are reported to be served in almost 400 census blocks, which equates to about almost 80% coverage, 78.2% coverage. And so when you look at this map, although you don't see 78% obviously of the geographic land area of the county served by cable, you have the cable obviously targeting where the population densities are. And so in that regard, the level of build out that's reflected here equates to 78% of the total address points. DSL is of course much more prevalent. Digital subscriber line or DSL service is the telephone company's response to how to use its existing copper wiring infrastructure to deliver broadband services. It's more widely available, obviously, because the infrastructure was there when they started to use this type of infrastructure to provide broadband decades ago. It's gotten better and better over the years, but it really tops out pretty quickly at or just below broadband speeds in most cases. And that distance, it's very distance dependent. So the distance an individual address is in proximity to the telephone company's central office, or in some cases, remote hub locations that they'll install specifically for this purpose. Your speed will depend on that. It'll vary significantly based on distance. It's relatively limited in that regard. So what you're seeing in this map is the area that is reported as being served with DSL at a broadband level, at that 25/3 level, which is a little more than half of your address points, and a total of 5,009 addresses throughout the county. If you look at all DSL, which is not something we really look at as an indicator of broadband, because in most cases it doesn't, a lot of it does not meet the threshold. In this case, almost half of it doesn't meet a broadband threshold, even as reported by the phone company. You get almost everywhere. And so it's not to say that there isn't an internet connection available. There just isn't one that meets broadband standards in those areas that are outside of that 25/3 zone. And so from that perspective, you have DSL pretty much everywhere, almost 95% of the address points. And this is going to be pretty much anywhere where there's phone service, maybe with a few exceptions where the distance is just too great for them to turn on that service in a reliable way. So again, we see that data. We don't entirely fully believe it, or we think there's nuances that really need to be understood about it, because again, they've reported this data. Even if the providers report it perfectly to the FCC, there's still, again, that intrinsic problem with it, which is it's going to show an entire census block as served, even if only one address is served. And so we dig in and do field surveys of the entire county and city in this case, to do the field verification of that data and really intending to refine those service boundaries in a much more precise way. The goal is really to generate reliable broadband infrastructure mapping for you, provide you with a really much more clear and accurate picture of broadband availability, and generate accurate GIS mapping around that with address level resolution. So we're really interested at this point in having a very specific count of where each type of service is available. This is important. It helps you in a number of ways at the stage you're at in strategic planning. Obviously, it helps you understand the challenges or what the need really is in terms of broadband availability. But it helps you understand that competitive landscape a bit better, which becomes very important as you engage in potential partnership negotiations with providers. They need to understand, and so they can do projections around take rates and revenues and what their costs are going to be when they look at potentially partnering with you. Having much better data than what the FCC database is able to provide is essential in their business planning. And so getting this kind of data up front allows you to jump into those kinds of planning efforts and negotiations with a lot more leverage and the ability to really support those in a helpful way to the private partners as well. And we also use the data that we find while we're out there, not just to look to see what's there, but also what it's going to cost to build something new. So we're also looking at utility poles. We're looking at the kinds of surface restoration that's required if there's underground construction required. Right-of-way congestion is going to be important so that we're able to understand variability potentially in cost barriers throughout the county in different areas that maybe are preventing build-outs from happening, or at least understanding what those costs are going to be in the event that a build-out does happen. So characterizing that on a detailed way throughout the county was another key goal of what our work entailed. So in terms of our methodology, again, we write out all the roadways throughout the county, obviously not including private driveways. You have a lot of long private roads and driveways, but that's generally not part of what we consider to be served or unserved anyway. It's the infrastructure and the public right-of-way that we're really concerned about. We sent out over the course of 2 weeks a two-person CTC team that included in each case one of our senior outside plant engineers. And they're doing this in a real-time way using a custom GIS-based application that codes the data with GPS coordinates and a custom app that we've built that allows them to relatively quickly capture this data as they're doing these ride-outs and generate GIS maps in real time. So again, we're looking at two things: the service availability. So we're identifying what type of infrastructure is there, whether it's fiber to the premises, cable, or just phone service, or all of the above in some cases. And also looking for indicators of underground infrastructure as well, things that tell us that there is in fact certain types of broadband infrastructure underground. Obviously, we can't see it when it's buried, but we can see the handholds, the pedestals, cable system, power supplies, fiber to the premises, customer equipment boxes that get mounted to the side of homes. So there's evidence even when the infrastructure itself is underground. And of course, then we're also quantifying in a pretty detailed way some of the most important things that impact costs when you're estimating the cost of a new build out. And the predominant one in an area like yours, where most of the utilities, most of the broadband infrastructure is above ground, is understanding what it's going to cost to get the utility poles ready for a new attachment, what we call make ready work. And this is the number one highest cost line item that a construction project is going to have when building out broadband. So it's very important that we understand, are those poles ready? Are they congested already? Is there space for new attachment? And if not, what sort of work is going to be required to make that happen? And in some cases, that's even replacement of poles. So yeah, we won't obviously go road by road and look at this for you, but this is a quick snapshot of what we've uncovered in this ride out and the types of mapping data that's generated as a result of that. And so we see proportional amounts here in terms of miles for the different types of service that probably just glancing at it, you're seeing that it correlates pretty well proportionately to what the 477 data suggested. Not exactly, but it suggests there is some decent correlation between the two. But we take this down again to an address level basis in order to get much more detailed data. So it's been very interesting, obviously, to correlate those two together and understand really to what degree the 477 data is accurate or not. And of course, when it comes to generating cost estimates and reporting to you what your broadband availability issues are, our data is going to be the reference and the gold standard here. But we think that looking at that correlation and understanding where there's discrepancies is an important thing to understand. In general, there's good correlation with minor single-digit percent deviations for cable and DSL. Where we did find a discrepancy is with the fiber to the premises, where we show, where we indicate what the 477 data on this map is, that red area, those block census blocks, and where we show it to actually be, where we've observed it in the field, is it's hard to see the blue lines there. I've got blown up maps I could show you, but you get the idea in terms of sort of the discrepancy. So we're showing that really we were able to identify that about 180 addresses are actually served by fiber to the premises. And that's only 2% of your address, of your population, essentially, whereas the FCC data would suggest it's a bit larger. We think that there's probably some reasonable explanations around that. Number one, it's a pretty small area to begin with. And so large reporting errors like this are easy to have occur. And in large part, the geographic land mass that they're showing that the providers are reporting as being served by fiber, much of this is consisting of large business parks. There's a hospital, medical complex, and a lot of undeveloped land. So this may correlate to address points that simply have nothing to serve on them. So there wouldn't be broadband infrastructure that we would be able to see. And to the extent that those larger businesses are served, we suspect that some of that is underground and completely hidden in a way that we wouldn't be able to identify in a handful of ways. So again, in terms of really understanding where you truly have fiber to the premises infrastructure built out at a density that suggests truly full availability to any resident or any address point, it's really limited to those 180 or so addresses that we could field verify. So we have then pretty good understanding, we think, of what's there and what the competitive landscape looks like to a provider who might be looking to do a build out or what it would entail if you were to do the same yourself without the help of a private partner. But in either case, it's important to understand what those costs are going to be if a build out were to occur and we were to bring broadband infrastructure, fiber to the premises, long-term scalable infrastructure to every home. So I'm not going to go into all of the details here. There's slides that you'll have, and there is a lot of detail in it that you can review. And of course, we can answer any questions that you have. But in the interest of not boring all of you and not spending too much time on this, I'll kind of hit the high points. But we use a model in generating cost estimates from an architecture perspective of, one that is cost effective. So we're looking to not create the highest end budgetary number, but what we think reflects what a provider would likely actually build, but with architecture choices and design decisions that ensure that it's flexible and scalable for the long term. So anything that is our cost estimates reflect the type of technology choices and architecture decisions that will absolutely support gigabit and 10 gigabit symmetrical services to every single home, which maybe seems like a lot today, but each year these kinds of demands on the broadband infrastructure are making these numbers seem less and less pie in the sky in terms of what real needs are and what type of infrastructure you need. From a construction perspective, we're very much looking to identify real world costs, leveraging aerial construction on existing utility poles wherever it provides cost savings. And so we make the cost effective choice in each case along each route to ensure that what we're presenting to you really truly reflects what a provider is most likely to build if you were to have a private partner incented to build out throughout the county. And of course, building into the design are all of the industry best practices around redundancy in backbone infrastructure to provide reliable services. So the numbers again reflect the type of infrastructure that really is going to deliver a long-term reliable product to your residents.
Hey, Matt.
Yep, go ahead.
Before you go too much farther, can you explain to the group here and online why we endeavored to go this route with even going, having us create a design? I want to make sure that the context is there for everyone.
Yeah, well, and you'll get into this in terms of what strategic next steps might be, but of course, the possibilities include anything from RFP processes to identify private partners who are willing to bring some capital to the table, maybe not all of it, that would to do a build out countywide, possibly county or city funded build outs. So you go it alone and bring construction contractors on board for some or all of the areas. So these estimates and designs are really intended to inform either or both of those processes. It's important that you understand what the cost factors are and exactly what it would cost you to build the network, and conversely, what those costs truly are to a partner, so that when they're telling you what it's going to take in order to provide this kind of service, you're able to validate that with your own numbers. And to the extent that there's discrepancies that need to be worked out in the negotiation process, you have a firm technical basis for those negotiations.
Thanks.
I don't know if I get what you're thinking there, Heather, but there's obviously nuance there.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I wanted you to say. Thank you.
So if we were to build this today, or if a provider would, we're talking about a design that encompasses about 597 route miles of new fiber. Most of that is going to be above ground on utility poles. We identified 85% of these routes as being good candidates for aerial attachment on utility poles, which is good news because on a per foot basis, it's a lot less. It's going to be a lot less expensive than placing it underground. Our design it also includes primary hub locations that would need to be built. That would be the locations where network electronics would be housed securely and reliably with a certain amount of redundancy. All in all, this would serve 9,020 passings. These are the serviceable address points throughout the county. That's the total target market in this context. I'll sort of skip through some of these. This is more background information about some of the design parameters that the conduit layer of the network and the utility pole layer. Conceptually, what different conduit and fiber layers of the network look like. It's important to understand these are relatively complex networks in a lot of ways in terms of identifying the specific unit costs associated with each of them. So we do a very in-depth, detailed design And I'll actually skip ahead to some of the maps to give you a sense of this. What comes out of our GIS team's design work with this process is a design that brings fiber to every single address point in the county, and creates a bill of materials, both in terms of the fiber components and the physical infrastructure components, like handholds and number of poles that make ready is required on handholds, splicing closures, all of these kinds of things. And again, there's multiple layers of the network that are built into this. So what you're seeing is just a small snapshot of the primary distribution layer of the network. And then layered on top of that is a secondary distribution layer that overlaps in some cases, and backbone fiber that feeds on top of that. So there's a lot of different components that go into these estimates. And this is without pulling out all the spreadsheets and going into detail that you probably don't want to understand at the moment. The takeaway is that these designs do go to this level of detail so that you can be assured that you're working with solid numbers and have the ability to break these numbers into different breakdowns to look at what costs are for different areas of the county as well. Here's another
math, right, Matt?
Yeah.
Yep. I'm sorry, was there a question there?
Nope, we were just commenting that that's basically like checking the math.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Here's just another snapshot. It's hard to show you the depth of all these things without showing you some pictures, but this is a downtown portion of Maysville. Gives you a sense of all the different layers on top of each other and what goes into that in terms of design work and what that looks like with the noise of the aerial imagery removed. So then we get into costs. We take the output of these very detailed designs and generate cost estimates for you. And just to give you a sense of how these roll up, there's more detailed bill of materials that feed behind these. But what you're talking about, hopefully this is not a surprise to anyone, but a countywide deployment is in the tens of millions of dollars, obviously, and specifically in this case, our baseline estimate is almost 62 million for the fixed components of the network. These are all of the parts that have to be built, whether or not you have even a single customer, and those are summed up at the line that says distribution network subtotal. And then you have some costs that are take rate dependent. So the more customers that actually sign up for service, these costs scale with those. And so these specific numbers in this table are correlate to a 40% take rate, which is a good middle ground number to look at in terms of what a likely threshold would be to make a network of this type commercially viable. Obviously, we haven't done that financial analysis yet, so 40% is more illustrative than anything at this point, with a total CapEx number of 65.2 million. And then this chart shows you how that scales. It's obviously a pretty linear correlation as more customers are brought on. Things like subscriber drops, the cable that goes right into their home, the customer premise equipment, and so on, they scale proportionally with those users. So that total CapEx number ranges between about 61.5 million up to almost $71 million, ranging from 0 to 100% take rate. An important number, just jumping back to this slide, is this per passing cost. You'll see of $6,825. That's a relatively high per passing number compared to commercial deployments of fiber to the premises throughout the country. So where you see fiber to the premises deployed most of the time, it's where that cost is in the $1,500 to $2,500 range typically. So that explains to a large degree why you don't have the kind of infrastructure that you would potentially like why you don't have fiber to the premises today. And why there's a need potentially for support or investment from the government to make that happen. It's worth noting that this isn't far off from really the average in terms of per passing costs for the rural deployments that were funded in 2020 with USDA Reconnect dollars, which I think was just around $6,000 per passing. So these aren't outlandish numbers, but they do point to what that challenge really is and what that barrier is in terms of needing to get over in terms of making a more commercially viable situation for private investment.
So Heather, did he say that 2,500 is the usual?
Matt, the
Yeah.
usual range is at 2,500 to 3,500. Is that right?
Well, in more dense markets, we may see that closer to even 1,000. I had said 1,500 to 2,500. That's a pretty loose number. Another way to look at it is in terms of passing density. And generally we see cable build outs down to about the 30 home per mile density level. In this case, your average density throughout the county is averaging just around 15 homes per mile. So you've effectively got half the density that we tend to see cable deployments happen outside of specifically mandated build out requirements and franchise agreements.
I just wanted to ask, does this take into account RD money?
Rural development.
Mm-hmm.
In what way?
Well, when I was with the league, we put in a couple of, we wired a couple of towns and with RD money. Just,
so in what way did you wire the towns? Meaning you had DSL service put in or telephone service?
no.
Cable.
Uh-huh. Internet. Yeah.
So
what he's, Matt, are you able to understand that?
Yeah, I mean, it takes into account in the sense that this isn't looking at funding source, it's or leveraging existing infrastructure. This is
just the gross money.
The fiber to the premises overbuild,
All right.
a standalone overbuild.
Yeah. So if you wanted a fiber to the premises standalone overbuild
Okay.
of what's there, right? Okay.
Yeah, upgrading existing cable networks would be a different cost altogether, depending on exactly what was proposed and what the cable operator needed to do.
And certainly is something we'll talk about when we get to that part of the conversation about options moving forward. This might be what the purpose of getting you a wholesale understanding of what it would take to get to a fiber to the premises, so that if you needed to, you could chop it up into bits. So maybe you have a cable provider that wants to upgrade. Then you have an idea of what it might cost them to do that, but you also have an idea what it might cost you to do other areas that they're not going to be touching. Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and so I think this is maybe a final map to show. These are the results of the plant, the make-ready analysis that happened at the same time that we were doing the service availability surveys. And again, the purpose of this was to not look to see, or this portion of it was not to see what was there. We did that as well, but to look at what the cost would be in making the utility poles ready for a new attachment. What kind of costs a provider would incur in being the next attacher to a utility pole. These are really important numbers because this is again the number one factor in determining what the build out costs are in a predominantly above ground aerial infrastructure area like yours is. And getting accurate numbers around this are going to be absolutely critical for any provider looking to that you enter into negotiations with, them understanding what that situation looks like. Eventually, if they're interested enough, they might go down the road of looking at this in detail on their own. But it may be harder to bring a provider to the table if without having this kind of detailed information up front. So on a route by route, foot by foot basis, we've quantified what those likely costs are going to be by looking at the poles, categorizing them in terms of how much work is necessary from essentially no make ready, which you do have quite a bit where it's very favorable in that regard. And that's important information for them to know, to exactly where they may have to put in a little more work and move things around on poles in order to create required clearances between attachments and clearances from their attachments to the ground and that sort of thing, mostly safety driven requirements, code requirements, to potentially needing to even replace poles due to lack of height. And so we've quantified that, and these are built into the cost estimates that I showed you previously. But as providers do their own analysis, that, you know, when you are in a negotiation phase, having this raw data to be able to provide them could go a long way towards helping those negotiations move along. And that's really it in terms of without going into a lot more technical detail on these things. Let me turn off the sharing. There we go.
Well done, man. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me figure out how to switch that back. 1 second, everybody. Can you see the screen on the, can you see that screen on the thing anymore? 1 second. Matt, I'm going to take over sharing here. 1 second.
You got it. I'm sorry for the technical complexity of having me in another spot.
I don't think we have too much time left. I'm not going to bore you too much, but I did want to check and see if you had any questions for Matt about his portion of the presentation.
So A, that's irregardless of any grant funds, any assistance. We're just building brand new, $63 million.
65 with a low take rate of 40%.
Well, the benefits of that are, you know, when we are talking to providers, either local or national providers, we've got, you know, data that better informs us of what their realistic costs should be, correct?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Very much so. The detailed estimates that aren't just based on back of the envelope kind of numbers. You put real engineering into this, real field survey work, the kind of thing that can cut months and months out of negotiations, or lacking could prevent negotiations from even moving forward.
Sure.
So this really helps inform those discussions.
Okay. Thank you, man.
Mm-hmm.
Any other? So we're going to get to that in just a second. And I don't think we have too much time, but are there other questions for Matt? So let's talk about funding outlooks then. I will try to get as close to this as possible. I'm going to touch on just a few of the federal programs that I think would be good fits. And then I'm going to glaze over this real fast because I know we're running out of time. And then I'll talk very briefly about some of what your options and our recommendations are for that. So I want to start with the Department of Commerce. They have what is known as the Economic Development Administration, and the Economic Development Administration got a significant amount of money as part of the stimulus over the last year. In fact, they were allocated about $3 billion. What they did with that money is they broke it up into 6 programs. And one of those programs was a legacy program known as the Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. And they've set aside approximately $500 million in that program to essentially support what the administration calls Building Back Better. This program in particular is very flexible. It is one that has started to be used in the last few years to build broadband infrastructure. The rub, of course, is that they currently do not support private applicants. So it would have to be a public infrastructure or a nonprofit infrastructure that would have to be built with it. And because of the economic status of the country, according to the EDA, it's a interesting program because the match is only 20% for that. Now, this is also a program in which you could consider building it and owning it yourself and hiring an ISP to manage, maintain, and operate it for you. So that is an option in thinking about this. It's not a program that's going to give you $65 million to pay for it. So just be aware of that. There is a puzzle that we put together, and generally we draw the puzzle, we put it together, we take it apart, we burn some pieces, we put it back together until, you know, something happens there. But it is something that you could think about as a grant option to help pay for an eventual something. The other program I want to talk about really quickly, you heard Matt mention Reconnect, that is the Department of Agriculture's Rural E-Connectivity Program. They have about $1.2 billion to give away in round 3. It was previously a pilot program for the first 2 years, and now it is a regulated program. What I like about this program is that eligible areas are anything less than 120. Eligible areas are rural areas. Eligible areas with less than 25.3 get an extra point bump in their application. You can ask for up to $25 million. Now, it is something that I would recommend you probably go find a private partner to be the lead applicant for and support them in that effort. But you know, we talked about 477 data before, not necessarily being the final be all and end all word of where service is. And USDA recognizes that integrally. And they have put it into the language that it is not dispositive. And that means that if you have data, which now you do, that shows where you do and do not have service, they're going to take a close look at that, and it will only help in your efforts to get some federal funding for the program. We talked very briefly, you asked about RDOF and how that plays in. If there are RDOF awarded areas in here, and there are 2 providers, one is Windstream and one is CCO Holdings. They technically have 6 years to meet their obligations, but they haven't actually finished going through and approving the RDOF awards yet. So they're only in round 2 of, they have to fill out a long form application and have that business model approved. So they're not done with that process yet. We're talking now a lot about timelines. How long will it take to get something done? For example, if you ended up partnering with Windstream or CCO Holdings, for example, and they wanted to apply for Reconnect, they could ask for more money for those same areas if they have a really good reason. So RDOF areas are eligible to a certain extent as part of the Reconnect application, but there will be some extra work that has to go into it to make that happen.
CCO will be a charter spec.
I think so. Yep. And I think I've already covered most of this, but I do want to mention that they have options for they call them different products. You can either ask for a grant, you can ask for a grant loan combination, or you can ask for a straight loan. So this is a pretty flexible program in that way. They're really looking to fill in the gaps. And I think that the county is probably a pretty good candidate for a Reconnect application with the right partner for you. Any questions about those? All right.
So when we're looking at something like that, besides the places that don't have service, so like the places that have unreliable service, would this data still help them if we were working with a partner or applying for a grant?
Yes.
That we could be specific about that kind of thing?
Yes, absolutely. And because it's so recent, because we did the speed test data back in August and September, that's even more helpful in the quest.
Didn't have service this morning.
Oh my, oh my. I'm sorry. I want to give you a quick overview of.
We got another question over there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you have a question? Oh.
You okay? All right. So I want to give you a quick overview of what's in the infrastructure bill, which either is being signed this week or will be signed this week at some point or early next week. I'm so excited about this. There's $42.5 billion in the BEAD program. I don't know why they call it BEAD-P. It should just be BEAD program, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. What this is going to do is essentially the same thing as the Treasury's Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. It's going to be basically block grants to the states, and you'll be guaranteed a certain amount of money to the state. The state will get to decide what to do with that money and how to do it, how to administer it. But they have 6 months to decide, or how do I say decide, to issue guidance on how those funds can be used. But again, 100 megabits download speeds is the thing. So that's really great for the county and the city overall. There's also middle mile funding in there to the tune of $1 billion. I don't know, that makes me very excited. We need good middle mile funding, especially for municipal type networks that need to get to certain places in certain ways. And those are going to be 70% grants. And then also really important, they're extending what we call now the emergency broadband benefit. It's going to be called the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACP. I'll remember that later. We like our acronyms in DC. What the emergency broadband benefit is, if you're not familiar, it is a program that the Universal Service Administrative Company oversees. They call it USAC through the FCC. What it does is it provides up to $50 a month to eligible participants. There's a long list of eligibility requirements that the provider bills USAC directly. So if you are eligible and you get signed up with your provider as an EBB benefit, they don't ask you for the money. It shows up as a credit on your bill and you don't have to deal with it. And I really like that as well. They are working, they did work in through the infrastructure bill, some additional consumer protections to make sure that the extension, which Congress doesn't understand in perpetuity. They'll never do something permanently. They only do it till it runs out of money. So they've given it enough money to last for many, many years. And that feels like in perpetuity. It's probably 14 or 15 years long. But it also will depend on the take rate for the emergency broadband benefit overall. So we see this as a way to reduce risk for ISPs. Coming into areas where they may not have been willing to go before because they're guaranteed to get paid overall. That's a risk reducer. Okay. The Kentucky ARPA funds, I'm not going to spend too much time here. Right now, they're in the middle of, I think, reviewing applications for a $50 million allocation. That initial allocation, basically they did an RFP process. They're looking to fund areas that absolutely have nothing more than 10-1 right now. So we're seeing that process play out. When that is done, I understand they'll issue another RFP for areas that still need service beyond the 10-1. And they've got additional money coming for the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund as well. That's going to go in there. And then, of course, the infrastructure funds. So I feel like we're all flush with broadband funds, and I'm really excited about it. And then let me give you an idea about timeline in general so that you have a sense of the urgency for some of these programs. Reconnect will come back around again. And so will the EDA program, the EAA will continue on. But if we're looking to do something soon, that means that sometime in the next few months, we would need, if you're interested in Reconnect, you'd need to find a partner fairly quickly because the applications are due by February 22nd of next year. I think they were going for the 2/22/22 number for alliterations purposes. The EDA program actually has what they call a rolling application deadline. And that, however, it's complicated because they have an edict to issue out all of that money that they've got allocated from the ARPA by September of 2022. So what they want to see is anybody who wants that funding to get their applications in by March 31st of next year. So that's the quick overview of that. Any questions about funding stuff? All right. That's my bread and butter, so feel free. I've got it all in there somewhere. All right, I want to make sure that we take a few moments to sort of give you an overview of what we think your options are and where you can go from here. Keep in mind that, we have a general understanding of, we've gone over what you've got in this. We know where you are now. You've got a lot of data about that, but we think what your priority is to really get affordable, reliable, robust broadband throughout the county as soon as possible. it's a imperative not only for remote schoolwork, remote work, distance learning, telehealth, but just economics in general for the county, because you're growing and you want to continue growing. So there are essentially five models to talk about. I'm going to lean on my notes a little bit here. Private investment. I've got the example of Lexington up there, but I can also say Scott County. I can also say Boone County. Private investment in general, what this means is that a private entity builds and owns the fiber. They do it with private capital and or a little incentive like a grant fund from the locality. There are generally no initial or ongoing capital costs for you, and the financial risk generally lies solely with the provider or the private entity. And it also, you know, again, I said you could incentivize by either providing support, maybe that's with an application, you know, going in on an application with them for a grant, or by giving them a grant from funds that you have available or funds that you plan to get in some form or fashion. The next option is leasing backbone and conduit and fiber. And what that means is that you would build that conduit and fiber and lease that asset to one or more private entities. And as part of the lease, you can then decide to price those assets at no or very low cost in return for a commitment by that private company to pay for the capital investment required to complete the build out of the infrastructure to all the homes and businesses, and to take on the operating risk of the network. And under that model, the city really and the county leverages the backbone of the conduit or fiber as a mechanism for securing more expansive investment by the private entity to complete the deployment of the network. And that generally offsets the ongoing cost and risk to you. And I think, yeah, Lincoln, Nebraska was on there. And then the third option is lease of your fiber overall, but you'd have to build it yourself and invest in that future. And then you would take the upfront capital investment to build the infrastructure throughout the entire county and city, including fiber to the premises, and then lease the fiber to a private entity to provide the network services to the public. This is a model that I think Matt DeHaven is pretty proud of, because he worked with the city of Westminster in Westminster, Maryland on this. And I think that their private partner was it Ting, Matt?
Yep, that's correct. Ting Fiber was ultimately the lessee of that fiber.
Yeah, and then basically by leasing the fiber, you're shifting basically almost all of the risk and the operating costs to the private entity.
You certainly can, yeah, in the negotiations. I mean, there's upfront risk in that you're building an asset potentially without those deal points defined, or you may even be building it on a speculative basis with the idea of building it and then allowing competitive access to it. But it is possible then, you know, once you are doing those negotiations and have identified candidate partners, to transfer ongoing risk to them in the form of guaranteed lease payments over the life of a long-term agreement that maybe is aligned with your debt service payments on the infrastructure. And operationally and the operational risk associated with marketing, and that could all be transferred to the provider in that case as well. So, and that's how it has ended up in some cases in these networks, particularly in the case of Westminster.
Yeah. The option 4, of course, is municipal deployment. I think that the words speak for themselves. You would do all of it, you would own it, you would operate it. We don't recommend that. And then option 5 is the anchor tenant model. And basically what that means is that a private entity, you would help a private entity break into the competitive broadband market by serving as its first customer and committing to deliver an ongoing revenue stream to that entity, and then essentially leases to you the fiber or conduit to provide network services. It allows you to essentially redirect spending power and generally improve your economic infrastructure while ensuring you get the highest quality network services at or below market value. It certainly is an option for you, but again, it may be more of a carrot and stick that you could use as part of something else. So, and that brings me very quickly to our overall recommendations. Essentially what we think, and I think you've heard this throughout our conversation, is cultivate a public-private collaboration. You can do that a number of ways. We think either model 1, 2, or 3, and generally retain model 5 as an option to incentivize the right private entity if it's combined with 1, 2, or 3. And so basically next steps would mean, you know, figuring out what it is you want to do next. And, you know, we're here to help with that process if it means issuing an RFP or an RFI. The difference is, you know, an RFI, you're sort of testing the waters to see what's out there, who might be interested. An RFP would be a lot more serious. We're ready to help with whichever one of those directions you'd like to go in. Questions?
Yeah, a bunch.
A bunch?
Figuring on that. Guys, anybody else?
Deployment of 5G. Time that we hired your company to consult today, like AT&T deployed 5G on their towers. You can download and take some amount of data. Would that kind of deployment countywide affect your what needs to be done?
Matt, do you want to take this one or do you want me to take this one? 5G?
But yeah, I couldn't hear most of the question, but in summary, is it essentially would a 5G deployment supplant the need for something like this? Is that
Correct.
the question?
Correct.
Yeah, and the answer is no. Wireless and wireline are certainly complementary, and actually where we're seeing large deployments of small cell densification and even 5G technologies, which are occurring primarily in more urban areas. It actually drives a huge demand for fiber infrastructure. And so actually having fiber infrastructure enables those kinds of things to occur. But a wireless connection like that at home, at least with the way those are marketed and made available today, they're generally at a there are effective data caps, even where they say that the data is unlimited, and the throughput doesn't begin to even truly approach what the wireline broadband connections can offer. So it certainly would help. It could fill gaps. We don't see any time in the near future that kind of infrastructure rolling out in a way that would be meaningful and impactful to broadband availability and in more rural areas in particular, where your biggest challenges lie.
And I think the short answer is, in order for 5G to work, you have to have fiber infrastructure to all of those towers anyway. Is that sort of the quick answer, Matt?
Yeah, that's right. And 5G is very short range oriented technology, even on a fixed basis. You know, you're not going to see commercial providers rolling out true 5G, not the kind of 5G that we hear talked about. It's mostly industry buzz terms in that regard, but providing gigabit type services over wireless, it's technically possible to do, but commercially, what you're seeing as 5G or 5G plus pop up on a brand new phone is not that kind of service. It's really just a faster version of 4G. It's a mobile technology, and it's not supplanting wireline connectivity needs. And those technologies are not being rolled out in more rural settings. It's really those investments are happening in more urban environments.
And I also think that most of the federal funding programs would not consider that to be a future-proofed option.
Most definitely not. Yeah,
that's a good question.
So maybe walk them through the RFP process that you guys are doing in Scott County and elsewhere.
Sure.
To identify with those.
So what we did with Scott County was actually, we started with an RFI process. At the time, we weren't sure. It was January, February of earlier this year. We weren't sure how much interest there would be from private providers. And we got, I think, 5 responses, and they were serious responses. And that was a good indicator that we would get serious responses to an RFP. And what we did is we designed the RFP to basically put the burden on the provider to sharpen their pencils and tell us what it would take to do a countywide or even just a piece of the county build. We provided them with essentially the same kind of data that we've done here, because we understand, we respond to RFPs all the time. We understand the effort it takes to really get a good response from a provider like that. So by giving them the mapping data, we're saving them time and helping them understand where that information is. We could even give them speed test data as well. And what we got were, I think, 5 really serious offers. And it gave the county in Scott County a lot to think about. And they had a lot of really good conversations with those providers about their offers. And ultimately, the way the RFP is set up is there's an evaluation criteria with weights and everything. And what you're looking for is the biggest bang for your buck. And that was certainly the driving factor in making those decisions in Scott County. So did that answer the question? Do you want me to? It was a process. There's a process. Once they selected a couple of the top 2 providers, they had further conversations. We issued a what we call a term sheet that basically mapped out everything that was in the RFP and asked them to respond to that. And the term sheet included things that they may have included in their responses as well, and asked them to respond to that as a best and final offer. And then the county was able to make a decision based on those offers. And then they began a negotiation process to finalize. So.
Could you even go through that process, identify what the private investment is, and therefore identify what the public investment would have to be, and then go after grants just for the public investment? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's also exactly what we're doing in Scott County is they have ARPA funds that they could use, but they decided that it made more sense and was more fiscally responsible to see if they could get a grant for their portion of it. So they've actively been working on that right now, even though they've, I think moved forward already. So, yes.
Time constraints, I'd make a motion that we adjourn this meeting.
Due to time constraints, and I appreciate all this information, it's like drinking from a fire hose. But I think we've got a regular scheduled meeting we need to get into. So I'd make a motion that we adjourn this meeting and go into the next.
And we will continue to have discussion with CTC and continue through this process.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Commissioner Brammer?
Yes.
Commissioner Cartmel?
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner Wood?
Yes.
Commissioner McKay?
Yes, ma'am.
Mayor Cottrell?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you give that back?
And we will take just a really, really brief recess and then start our meeting.